So at this point we have talked about both what functions are and how we can use them, and how we can get some very useful functions by importing functions through packages. But there are definitely going to be moments in your programming journey where you are going to want to make your own functions, because you want to make one specific to your program and code. Luckily, making your own functions is extremely simple. There are just some basic rules I want to cover. Now, while we have previously used making functions as an example for other topics, such as the player stats function from a little bit ago, they were extremely abstract and didn't go in depth into what is needed for an actual function to operate. So right now we are going to be covering a skeletal system of everything that needs to be included in a function to get it to work. Now think back to the 4 different types of functions that we talked about previously. Functions that do and don't return values, and functions that both do and don't take in arguments. For creating your own functions, we are just going to go down the list and talk about how to approach creating them, starting with the most basic of the bunch. One which takes no arguments and returns no values. But before we start, there are a few small things I want to note about function naming conventions. The variable naming conventions we talked about previously also translate over to function names. So you can't have 2-word functions, and you can't use specific characters like periods or commas. Generally, you are going to want to follow the same camel case style, which we talked about in the variables lecture. Alright, so in general, for making functions, each language differentiates how to tell the computer that it's a function. In Java, you have to define the function scope, which is something you don't really need to know unless you are going to become more invested in Java. But basically, it tells the computer which parts of code can use the function and which type can't. For this series, all of our functions are going to be public. From there, you then determine which type of function it is. So in this case, since it won't be returning any variables, we will just put void to signify this type of function will not be returning anything. Finally, you put the function name after those 2 identifiers along with a set of parentheses, like so. Parentheses are where your arguments would go if you were making a function that took in arguments. But since for our first type of function we are not incorporating arguments into this function, let's just leave that blank. All of this is just for Java. Python, on the other hand, all you do is put def, short for define, and then the function name with a set of parentheses. So as you can see, each language is going to be different. But the main thing that we want to remember is to always add parentheses. From there, we just type what we want our function to do within the confines of the function and then close off the loop, and we are done. Easy peasy. In Java, the confines of the loop would be whatever is contained within the curly brackets, and in Python it would be until you are no longer intended. At its core, this is the most primitive type of function we have just made. Something which takes in no arguments, and returns no values. Quite similar to print_stats function from earlier on. Moving on to the next type of function, creating a void function that takes in arguments. Now this process is going to be very similar to the previous, except for one small adjustment. Remember the parentheses that I mentioned like 30 seconds ago? Well, we put any variables we want the user to pass into the function into these parentheses, and then we call that specific function. It will be required to have those variables passed into it. For example, in Java, let's make a function that takes into numbers and prints out the product of those numbers. We start with the public void plus name of function setup, since again we won't be returning any values. And now comes the new part. Inside the parentheses, you define which type of variables you want to pass in as arguments, in this case an integer, and then a name for that variable. This name is what you will use to refer to the integer the user passed in. For this example, let's just call it num1. Then, if we want to add another argument, we simply add a comma in between the two, and we can make another integer variable num2 to hold the second number. We could do this however many variables we want to pass into the function, but for now, let's close off the parentheses and just print the product of num1 and num2. As you can see, we refer to the two numbers the user will input to the function as num1 and num2. Now, whenever we want to call the multiply numbers function, we just have to make sure that we are putting two numbers in as arguments. In this case, the number 5 becomes num1 and the number 8 becomes num2. From there, we simply run the code and the number 40 is printed to the console. It's important to note that you can also mix and match variables when making arguments. So you can have some function which takes in a char, an integer, and two strings, all within one function. Pretty neat in my opinion. The last thing I want to mention about arguments is that when you call a function, you have to follow the variables you defined when making the function. So for our multiply numbers function, you could not put in a string and then an int. It has to be two integers because that's what the computer is expecting to be passed into the function. So now that we have gone over how to make functions that don't return variables, we have to cover those that do. And we will start with ones that don't take in arguments. Now the main difference between defining functions that return variables and defining ones that do not is that in some cases you have to specify that you want this function to return an integer variable. This is most commonly used in Java, where you would replace void with int to tell the computer that you want this function to give something back to you in the form of an integer. This works the same as if you want to return a string, char, or even an array. You simply replace the word after public with whatever variable you want to be returned by the function. The most important thing to remember about making functions that return variables is that no matter what path your code takes, it must return a variable, no matter what. What does this mean? Well, let's say you had some string function in a game, and inside of it there was an if statement where the player score was above 10. You returned a congratulatory message. This works fine if you print the result of this function and the player score is above 10. But if the player score was less than 10, then you don't enter the if statement and then you don't have something prepared to be returned to the user, and so the function is going to throw you an error. You have to have all your paths covered, which may seem simple, but if you are making a function with a switch statement in it containing high amounts of cases, this can get out of hand quickly. Something I like to do, just to make sure this doesn't happen, is put a return statement at the bottom of the function with a string or an integer so unique that I'm able to tell that the code is not running properly and can fix it. The main point I'm trying to get across, however, is always cover your exits and always have a return statement prepared for any case the user may throw at you. Another small thing to note is that you can't return one type of variable if you have already defined the function to return another type. For example, you can't return a string in an integer function or vice versa. The return statement must always match the type of function no matter what. The final type of function is one that returns variable and also takes in arguments, and for this all you need to do is combine what we have learned from the previous cases. First, you assign your arguments in between the parentheses, making sure you have also defined what variable you want to return, and then ensure that no matter what path the code takes, that you are always returning that variable type. That concludes our discussion on functions. As you can probably tell, functions are extremely vast subject area, and require a little bit of practice to fully understand, which is why later on I will recommend some websites you can use to practice these more difficult topics, or you can check out my other courses when I teach you different programming languages.